I'm going to show you a different way of applying watercolour paint in this step-by-step seascape tutorial. Let's get started. I'm starting off with the yellow ochre, painting it wet in the sky and tilting to allow the paint to flow and to look more natural in the sky. And I'm just collecting the puddle at the side there with my size 10 round brush. So again, I've really loaded my brush and I've dropped a puddle of that yellow ochre at the side, and I'm tilting to the right to allow the paint to flow in the paper without me touching the paper with my brush, which creates some beautiful washes. I'm applying some of the cobalt blue at the top there, a big puddle, and I'm going to allow that to sort of run into the painting without me using my brush. As you can see, it looks more natural. Another way of doing this is to get your brush and to squeeze the brush hairs to allow the paint to sort of drop onto the wet painting. And as you can see there, you get sort of accidental effects. Not quite sure where the paint was going to go, but it does create some beautiful effects, as you can see there. And I'm just using the brush just to coax that paint off the edge of the page. So I'm adding some of the Venetian red with a mix of the cobalt blue and just dripping it onto the painting. It actually dripped a little bit in the horizon area, but I'm just going to go with it. And I'm tilting and using the sort of wet brush there just to coax the paint. And I'm actually dripping now, squeezing the brush hairs, allowing that mix there to sort of drip onto the paper and then tilt it in the other direction. And you get these beautiful undisturbed washes. And it's a great way of painting an atmospheric sky, and by tilting the colours blend and mix together. And take your time when you're tilting, as well, as you can see I'm doing here. And again, dribbling another little bit of the Venetian red and cobalt blue mix, randomly, accidentally creating these clouds. It's quite magical, and I find this really therapeutic. If you're worried about spoiling your paper, don't worry. If it goes wrong, you can wash your sky off under the tap and have another go. So I've added cobalt blue here with a pinch of that Venetian red just to darken up the blue, dripping it onto the top of the painting where it will be darkest, because that's the sort of foreground of the sky, and then tilting. I'm using cold pressed paper, 300 grams, and it's on a watercolor block. And as you can see, I've used some washi tape to tape around the border. It'll give me a lovely white edge when I finish my painting, and it's a really nice way of presenting your work. And as you can see, extreme tilting gets some fabulous results. And I'm just collecting the puddle there with a clean, damp brush, so that doesn't run back into the painting, so you get the control. And I'm still tilting to get that paint moving. One of the techniques I love using for skies, cloudy skies, is to lift out the clouds with a paper towel while the paint is still wet. You can really create your own sky this way and sculpt those clouds. Take your time with this. Don't just sort of press down with a great big piece of tissue. Use it delicately and lift off to make the clouds look more natural. So the clouds should be bigger at the top of the sky and get smaller towards the bottom. And remember, less is more. It's so easy to get carried away with this technique. What I'm doing now is I'm mixing up a big puddle here of the cobalt blue with about 30% Venetian red, and again I'm dripping it into the top of the sky, so it's a darker wash. It's still wet, so the surface is wet, my paint is wet, as you can see, and it's sort of maneuvering itself around that cloud that I lifted out as well, so it's really bringing out the light of the cloud. And I'm now tilting to allow the paint to flow to the top of the painting there, adding a little bit more of that colour and using the brush hairs and squeezing the paint onto the wet surface, and again tilting, allowing these sort of accidental cloud formations to appear. So be patient with this as well, and if your sky is drying, give it a very gentle spritz with a spritzer bottle with water. and this should help with the sky drying out too quickly. So as you can see here, I've got some interesting light clouds there with lovely edges, and that's where I lifted out the clouds to create sort of a dry sort of space there. So the wet paint's running into a dry area, so you get some lovely crisp edges. And I'm lifting off a little bit more here, really sculpting this sky to make it my own. And you need to do this while the paint is wet. If it dries off too quickly, it tends to really soak into the paper. So just be aware of the wetness of your paper. When it's very shiny, that's the time to lift. So as you can see here, I'm gently lifting the wash here and sort of really varying the marks as well with the paper towel. I tend to not scrunch it up in my fingers and squeeze it. I tend to let it kind of be a little bit more loose, so it creates the accidental edges with the tissue here and there. As you can see, I'm using it in quite a random way here. I love randomness rather than sort of creating a pattern. I want it to look more natural this way. Now you could leave your sky here, but I want to experiment even more. So I'm mixing up the cobalt blue with a pinch of the Venetian red, a milkier consistency, squeezing the brush hairs and letting the paint drip onto the paper. It's a little bit more blue in this wash, and I'm just tilting around that left cloud and in the center of the top of the sky. And as you can see, I'm tilting all directions, really getting that paint to move, see what happens. Really extremely tilting there just to get that paint moving. As your painting dries off a little bit, the paint doesn't move as quickly. It moves very fast when it's very wet. So you might need to just hold it longer in one direction. I'm just collecting the puddle with a clean, damp brush. So while the sky is still damp, I'm mixing up a slightly thicker consistency of paint using the cobalt blue and the Venetian red there. Just a touch more Venetian red. I'm varying the colour, so one's got more blue, the other one's got a little bit more of the red, taking the excess paint off on my paper towel. So my brush is damp and the surface is damp, and I'm painting damp into damp, some imaginary distant land here. So it's smaller and it's cooler in colour, so it recedes. It has a soft edge, so it gives the illusion that it's further away. I'm using my framing tape there to tilt my board to about a 30-degree angle to help that paint from the distant land run down instead of running up into the sky. I'm mixing up creamier cobalt blue, about 70%, with 30% Venetian red, and I'm painting damp into damp, this time with my size 6 round brush, leaving sort of gaps where you can see that paler underpainting there. It's just to create a little bit of detail to this distant land, but not too much. It's just a slightly stronger tonal value. And as you can see, it adds interest without coming forward too much. Just adding a little bit more of that mix there, painting damp into damp. You may find swapping to a small brush is more helpful with this to control the amount of paint. I'm actually adding ultramarine instead of the cobalt blue to the Venetian red. I felt the cobalt blue wasn't giving me dark enough tonal values here. And I'm painting this creamier wash damp into damp at the bottom of that land there. This is a fun technique. Rinse your brush, take all the excess moisture off your brush, and then lift out the paint and repeat. You may have to repeat the same place over and over, but just keep rinsing that brush so you don't have a dirty brush contaminating your painting. And what I'm doing, as you can see here, I'm lifting out some white sails in the distance. It's quite effective, and you can do as many as you like. You can do 1 or 5. Here is a close-up here, and it's a really nice technique to practice as well, lifting off using a clean, damp brush. You can see it's quite effective, and they're quite small. They've got soft edges, so they look further away. Sometimes you'll look back and the paint has creeped back on itself. Just again, rinse your brush, take the excess water off on the paper towel, and sort of lift off again. If that doesn't work for you, you can use the paper towel scrunched up into a really small sort of shape and lift off with the paper towel, or even a Q-tip, whatever works for you. And if all else fails, you can use white gouache at the end of your painting. And I think it's a good idea now to allow my painting to dry. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to paint the sea. So I'm wetting the sea area with my size 10 round brush around the rocks that I've sort of drawn, my imaginary rocks, but I'm painting over the smaller rocks with the water here and there. You can mix it up a little bit, and I'm using the yellow ochre to start with, painting a very thin wash of yellow ochre, kind of like an underpainting around those rocks, leaving some white gaps as well. I'm mixing up the cobalt blue with the Venetian red, bit of leftover paint, and adding some cobalt teal. Now, if you don't have that colour, don't worry. You could use cerulean, Prussian blue, phthalo blue, or turquoise. I've fully loaded my brush and I'm squeezing the brush hairs to allow a blob of watercolour to fall onto the wet surface, and I'm tilting and dribbling, and I'm not actually painting this with my brush. I'm allowing the paint just to flow where it wants to. I do actually collect puddles with a clean damp brush just for a bit of control, so don't worry, you can use your brush, but it's fun to try something different, a different way of applying watercolour. It really does look fresh and beautiful. I've just removed my framing tape there, it was getting in the way. Here I'm tilting. I don't need the framing tape to tilt my painting at the moment. I'm just varying my colours and just adding some water there just to get that paint moving. It was a bit dry in this area. So I'm teasing the paint, but I don't want to touch it too much. I want it to be really fresh, and I find this way really does create the most amazing, beautiful, transparent washes. The less you touch watercolour with your brush sometimes, the better it appears to be. So as you can see there, it looks quite sort of a beautiful grey colour there, and I'm just sort of lifting a damp brush just to get that sort of light area to carry on to the edge of the page. It was sort of sitting up a little bit. It's kind of supposed to be a little bit of a wave coming into the shore, so I'm just doing that both left and right of that using a clean damp brush. I noticed the foreground area of the sea here had dried out, so I'm just wetting it gently again, just with clean water. So just around those rocks, and I'm mixing up ultramarine here with a little bit of phthalo blue on the right, so, and a touch of that Venetian red in the phthalo blue just to darken it up. So you've got the ultramarine to the left, phthalo blue with the Venetian red to the right, squeezing the brush hairs there with allowing the paint to drizzle from the edge of the painting onto the painting, and just teasing the edge of the painting here. So starting on the washi tape, allowing the paint to run from the edge, tilting as I go, and just teasing here and there with my brush around the rock area here as well, using the tip of the brush. I've just rinsed my brush here and I'm just softening the edge there, bringing it over onto the rock so I don't have a hard, awkward edge, and I'm just lifting off with the paper towel. I'm just using a clean damp brush just to extend that white wave there, and just sort of softening some of the rocks as well, just manipulating some of the paint here and there, and just glazing over that rock to create some shadow. I'm mixing up some ultramarine with a pinch of the Venetian red and just painting it in the sort of shallows of the water, damp into wet here and there with my size 8 round brush, just to create some darker tonal values, using water here to blend. Using a little bit more of the cobalt teal and adding it in the shallows here, wet into wet, then tilting, allowing the paint to run, adding a touch more here to the left, very wet, and just allowing it to run almost into the damp paint. So I may get some cauliflowers, and you get cauliflowers and blooms when you put or paint a wet wash into a drying wash, but I thought that might be quite nice. It has run over the rock in the centre, but not to worry, that will be darker later. I'm tilting my painting. I'm using my spritzer bottle just to spritz some of the paint here to get it moving, maybe to lighten it up a bit. And it's a great way of manipulating the paint without actually using your brush to sort of disturb the paint. It keeps everything really fresh. So I'm mixing up some phthalo blue here, quite creamy, with a touch of quinacridone gold. And I'm just adding that damp into wet into the sea. And it's a lovely sort of turquoisey colour. And as you can see, I've got my painting on a complete sort of 90-degree angle, letting it all run down. Just added some more Prussian blue, thick and creamy, and just using my size 6 brush just to allow that paint to run down, creating darks, damp into damp here and there. As you saw there, I added some Paynes grey to the phthalo blue just to darken it up even more. I've decided to leave the sea alone and concentrate on the rocks. So I've wet them and I'm applying some greens and blues and burnt siennas and Paynes grey here with my plastic card, sort of swiping the colours on there. And those lovely darks really sort of stand out. Now you can wait for your sea to dry, or you can paint this sort of damp into damp so you get some lovely soft edges. And I'm spritzing the foreground there and applying that yellow ochre again, wet into wet with my 1-inch brush, and using that brush to paint some darker reflections with ultramarine and burnt sienna. And I'm using Paynes grey here and a bit of burnt sienna and painting the rocks with the plastic card in the foreground. And I'm applying some more paint here, ultramarine, Prussian blue and Paynes grey to the rocks nearest here on the right in the foreground to bring them forward, creating more detail and texture. I love the plastic card technique. I'm swiping it here to create light in the water and just lifting off some of the damp paint to create lighter rocks here and there as well. You want to do this when the paint is damp and not too wet or not too dry, because it won't lift off, but it's so effective. I think it's a good idea now to allow my painting to dry. What I'm doing now is I'm just using some white gouache and I'm applying it wet on dry with my plastic card here and there. And it just creates a little bit of light and sparkle. It looks like little waves up against the rocks there. And it really does pull the painting together. What I quite like about it is you get sort of quite nice sparkly effects. I'm literally using the gouache straight from the tube as well. There's no sort of water added there, so you get some lovely opaque white marks. And I'm sort of printing as well, so you get some really nice straight edge but it's kind of blobby bits where it looks like a little bit of surf. And I'm just adding a little bit more to the water and then using a little bit more white paint to sort of swipe on top of those dark rocks so it looks like a big splash from the sea here and there as well, and just a few more light marks in the foreground. As I said at the beginning of this tutorial, you can use white gouache to paint the white sails, but you can also use the white to paint some white reflections of the sails wet on dry in the water. And I'm doing this with my size 4 round brush and just using a clean damp brush just to blend and soften that white in the water. I'm finishing off with a spatter around the rocks here to look again like a big splash of light and texture to finish off my painting. And here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you like this content and you'd like to support the tutorials I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below, but you will get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials and downloadable outline sketches, and you can cancel anytime. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.